Hey, Media People podcast listeners. If you enjoy the podcast, then you're going to love our newsletter, appropriately named the Media People Newsletter. Delivered right to your inbox, each edition is a mix of original and curated content designed to feed your curiosity while aiding in personal development. On top of more podcasts, we'll connect you with articles, interviews, and industry events. Subscribe at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or go to mediapeople.beehiiv.com. That's BEEHIIV. Thanks for listening to the Media People podcast, lively and insightful chats with the people who power the media industry. I'm your host, Victor Genova. For more episodes, you can go to mediapeople.ca or subscribe wherever you get podcasts, including youtube.com/@mediapeoplepodcast. Views expressed by participants are personal. Kabil Rahaman is the head of commercial data at the Globe and Mail, leading the company's charge in the application of data monetization. Born in Zambia to Guyanese parents, Kabil and his family moved to Canada when he was 3, where they settled in Brampton, Ontario. He studied anthropology at the University of Waterloo, dabbled in sales after graduation, before making the jump to ad operations with Suite 66. He moved agency side, holding senior roles at Accuen and Omnicom Media Group. Kabil Rahaman stops by to chat about growing up in Brampton, why his influences range from George Orwell to Ken Griffey Jr., his career in advertising, and leading data monetization at the Globe and Mail.
The Globe and Mail is one of the largest publications in Canada, like in news media. It's actually very ubiquitous about how news is covered in Canada, but also the Globe and Mail has a media and advertising part to it, and specifically it's like advertising on the Globe, but also events, podcasts, and content. So what I do at the Globe and Mail is that I lead our data capabilities for advertising and our subscriptions business. What that means is that from all of the information that we collect about our readers, we use it in a way to either retain the ones that we do have, attract new readers, and then also work with advertisers and how we are able to connect our readers with advertising that's meaningful and influential.
Kabil, thank you so much for dropping by today. Before we get into it, I want to call out that once again, I have another Olive Media alumnus in the call, but we're going to get into your time at Olive Media. Let's go back to the beginning. Where are you from?
So it's actually a funny question you'd ask that, and especially for people who are immigrants or people of color, but that's sometimes a loaded question to ask them. So it's something to be something that I like to joke about, but at the same time too, it's also really important to hey, so I'm from Canada. I would answer the question that I'm from Canada, but I wasn't born here, like many others as well too. So my family's origin begins in Guyana, but specifically I'm born in Zambia. So at some point in time, there's a good understanding of why Zambia and Guyana have relations. So my dad moved there once our family was kind of started. My brother and I were born there in the early 80s. Moved to Canada in the late 80s, and they're settled in Brampton. So that's mostly where I grew up. Yeah.
So do you have triple citizenship? Is that even something you can legally do in the world?
I don't think so. Technically, where I was born is I retained a Guyanese citizenship. So at this point, I have a dual citizenship between being Canadian and being Guyanese, even though I've never lived in Guyana. So it's just kind of the way all these things work out. I think I'd have to rescind or denounce my citizenship or claim to citizenship in Zambia, which is now later on in my life, I realized that, oh, hey, this could have been very interesting if I ever wanted to live there or work there at some point in time. But at this point, no. I don't think you can have triple citizenship, even though I'd be I was born there.
Do you have any memories of your time in Zambia? I know you said you left when you were 3, but is there anything that still resonates? Even maybe when you go back and look at an old photo album, maybe that kind of jars a memory?
Definitely when I look at some old photos of definitely my baby pictures are all from Zambia. Some of those I do have memories of. Some of my earliest memories, or all of my earliest memories, are really of ones with my brother and sister and family, and specifically like something related to toys or something related to an activity that we were doing, like I was very young.
Do you remember emigrating to Canada though? Like as a 3-year-old, maybe you remember moving, but was it a big deal? Like, did you understand like the magnitude of moving literally across the ocean from one continent to another?
I didn't understand that part of it, but it was definitely interesting to meet my grandparents for the first time. Because we hadn't had any visitors when we were living in Zambia, so all of my mother's family was in Toronto or in Brampton, and all of my dad's family is in Queens, New York. So it was kind of interesting to meet all of these like new people. I didn't know the difference of whether it would be cold because it was like I think late fall or at least fall when we'd moved. So the magnitude of it is kind of like lost on me so much so is the orientation to being here, which was much more different than like the first time. I remember the first time I'd ever touched snow or seen it, or worn, for that matter, had worn a winter coat or a hat. Like these are like new things that I remember experiencing as like a 3, 4 year old.
What did you think of when you saw snow for the first time? And did the novelty wear off? Because when I speak to people who come from tropical locations, they're like, oh, snow is great. And then it seems like after 5 minutes, they're like, all right, I'm done with it.
It's something that I enjoyed as a kid. Like I remember enjoying like the texture of it, and like the texture, the feel of snow, especially because like you learn the difference between like packing snow, and I know there's like many different names for snow, but like packing snow in particular is something very novel of how you could like push it together into a ball and throw it. That's I it's really hard even today to like see packing snow and not have a desire to like make it into like a baseball sized shape and throw it at a target that's somewhere somewhere that I think is would be fun to hit.
What was life like growing up in Brampton?
Brampton, like if I look at my early childhood was like very good. It's also very very different in that like growing up there in the late '80s, early '90s, being like basically just like a handful of people in my school who looked like me or even less. So it's kind of um, it was kind of a very unique experience that I think about now, where there are a lot more people in my like adult life that look a lot like I do or have like a similar like walk or come from a similar walk of life. When growing up, the only being like the one of the only kids who have like a Caribbean heritage in your neighborhood, let alone your school, let alone your neighborhood, makes it a little bit like difficult to adjust to that. But you do. The only like the things that I would probably think about is that it became really good in understanding the way, like understanding how things are here, and I very much feel a part of what I do here. So you think about like the like the winter sports and playing, let's say, learning to skate or playing hockey is like part of the culture of being Canadian. That I think that was like a really good thing, but at the same point in time too, like I look back on some of these experiences being different and how you can still be similar, but still like understand and appreciate what that difference looks like. Having a different like name or having a different skin color or having different food that you eat at home. Like these are all part of understanding, like appreciating the similarities and the differences that we have.
What were your interests or hobbies growing up?
Um, they're pretty like pretty varied. Like I think you for millennials, I think looking back on like the '80s and '90s, like the things that really come up are like the cartoons and video games and movies and stuff like that. So I think those are really big. I loved playing sports. I love playing sports. I don't know what it would be. Like the big things are like really being able to play baseball, play football, basketball is also very big as well too. But like it would be hard not to put anything science fiction related up there. Like it, aside from the sports, it permeates like the things that I really like. Science fiction has its impact on movies, video games, TV shows, and even music.
Video games are an interesting one because I'm a kid of the 80s and 90s as well too. And I found in the 90s and even the late 80s, you were never really happy with the video game system you had because the new one that was right around the corner was making such a massive leap in terms of graphics and sound and everything else. And now here we are in 2025, and all I want to do is get my hands on a Super Nintendo or a PlayStation 1 or an N64.
I like long for the more simpler like I long for like those simpler experiences from time to time. I'll have to admit that even a couple of days ago, I think I stayed up. I think I probably played this one level in Tetris for like the Tetris on NES, like a Nintendo, for probably 3 hours. After I really wanted to tell my daughter, like, oh, I finally finished this level. And she was like well asleep at that point for like for a couple hours. But like I remember struggling with this when I was a kid and like being now like an adult. I was like, oh, I finally beat it. It only took like, it only took like 35 years to do it.
Yeah, no, I concur with what you said early on, though, about something a little bit more simplistic, because I remember I had a PlayStation 2 and I got Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell at a discount sale. And I could not believe the number of like training or test levels I had to go through before I was actually comfortable enough to play the game properly. You didn't have that with like Super Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog or anything like that. You just jumped in and you learned on the fly and it was okay and it was quick to pick it up, but you're right, it has become a lot more complicated.
Complicated is good in some sense. Like where I think complicated is doesn't work where it takes the fun out of the game. Like if you
Yes.
think about how like if you played I don't know if you play any like the new NHL games and learning how to use like the active stick to keep the puck away from another player versus like, hey, I'm Jeremy Roenick and I'm just gonna score from anywhere on the ice if I touch the puck in NHL '94, right? So
Yep, I remember that. It
uh,
was the whole top-down view, or just kind of the rink was like portrait size. It was like you go up and you go down, and that's about it.
Yeah, I think there's like don't get me wrong, like the new games and especially some of the new games that draw on the mechanics of the built from old, I think are really good and like kind of pay homage to where games have come from. I think that's really great. And I would say that like the newest, like the newest Zelda games are fantastic. They're fantastic. Like you're immersed in them and you don't even look at what time it is. By the when you've already logged like 2 3 hours at a time. It's kind of crazy compared to like the first time I played Legend of Zelda. I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Like, you like
Yep, I'm with you on
you
that.
walk into a cave and you're like, oh, I'm dead now. Oh, just start again. Like, yeah, like there's something that's there's kind of you can look at there's like an imbalance in some ways in that like simplicity, but in many ways like I think I like the if you're thinking about how you want to like project your if you want to kind of like or let's say project your understanding of a world into what you're experiencing in the game, then I think that's a really great thing, regardless of whether it's like a game that was made this year or a game that was made like 40 years ago. I think that imagination and that kind of like projection of that imagination is really important for you to like appreciate games or like I said, games, movies, TV shows, any kind of media, you can kind of project those kinds of like symbols and beliefs onto them.
You've got a pretty diverse cross section of influences. Let's start first with Frank Thomas and Ken Griffey Jr., because you've already alluded to being a baseball fan. So, what attracted you to baseball? Like, what is that your favorite sport? And what was it about Frank Thomas and Griffey Jr.?
I think growing up, baseball was my favorite sport. My dad loved playing cricket. He's
Ah, I see
excellent
the connection. Yes.
excellent at it. So my brother, so because we're here in Canada, not a lot of people play, like this is the early 90s, not a lot of people play cricket. A lot of people play baseball, and the Jays are really popular during the early 90s. and so like I think I pick up a baseball glove the first, I think when I'm like 6, maybe 7, I pick up a baseball glove. My brother's really, really into it. And um so baseball becomes kind of like my first love of sport. Um and with Frank Thomas and Ken Griffey Jr., also like superstars from the 90s, which in retrospect, it turns out like they were like one of the only like both of them are like one of the only superstars that weren't tainted by like like the steroid and drug use that happened during that time. So I think it's sort of interesting that those two kind of popped up. But with Frank Thomas, I was always a bigger kid. I usually played first base or outfield, and he he was just so disciplined about how he hit. And he wasn't like a terribly good first baseman. Well, I think there was one year where he did win a Gold Glove. Um, but watching him and his discipline and the way how he hit was fantastic. Just like the way how he would wait, the way how he would like observe pitches and his patience was really good. And it's also really hard not to love Ken Griffey Jr., like the kid and his smile. Um, that he was like a 5-tool player. And then on top of that, like he has the most perfect swing. Growing up, I also like I could switch hit, and but I always wanted to because I always wanted to swing a bat like Ken Griffey Jr. That I always practiced my Ken Griffey Jr. swing, but I could never do it from the right side. So it's like having two different batting stances that I eventually just had to pick one and hit right-handed because like it was too bizarre trying to like maintain two different batting stances.
Did you play his baseball video game as well? I think it was on Super Nintendo, Ken Griffey Jr. Baseball.
Yeah, of
That was a
course.
good one.
Of course. Last year I was at Tilt, this arcade bar. I think I was playing Ken Griffey Jr. baseball with one of my friends just for an hour. And it's crazy how you can have so much fun with like how wild you can throw a pitch, but also that like you'd like strike out and you'd literally see a dude break his bat over his knee, which I thought was fantastic for I guess whatever there would have been 93, 94.
So going back to cricket, I spent some time living in the United Kingdom where cricket is very big. And I want to know, are you a cricket purist or do you dabble in 2020?
I will tell you neither. Like, I kind of park that into like, oh, this is one of like the things that my dad really enjoys. And I would occasionally watch it, but I would never be like, I, it's hard for me to understand like the length or complexity of how these are set up.
Well, let's just
So
throw that out there for anyone who isn't cricket savvy. Test cricket can go on for 5 days. It starts at sunrise, finishes at sunset, and it could still end in a draw. And we're not joking when we say that.
yeah, that's the thing that I'm used to watching that as a kid, as opposed to now. Like especially like last year, I think it was the Cricket World Cup. I was like very, very excited because like my dad was watching it, and I bought him a West Indies. I bought him a West Indies jersey for his birthday, and I was looking back at this. I was like, wow, there's some really impactful people who played on this team during the 70s and 80s, and like these are people that were important to him. Like those are like my dad's Ken Griffey Jr. and Frank Thomas.
Let's talk a little bit about the sci-fi writers you also looked up to growing up. Start first with Orwell, because anytime you hear Orwell, and you hear a lot about it now, everyone likes to refer to this and that being very Orwellian. What got you into George Orwell?
There was, I think, one of the very first cartoons I'd ever watched, and this is like one of my early, like an early memory. I don't know whether it's from Zambia or whether it's uh, from living here. Is that I watched the cartoon version um, of Animal Farm when I was like very very young, and it had this. This is like an imprint on me about the relationship between the people who do work and the people who make you do the work, and the relationship between those who have power and those who don't. And so I think that sort of like, although I really loved this, I love this one character called Boxer. He's the horse. He eventually spoiler alert, like he ends up dying at some point because he has to build a windmill twice, and he's like the most like the strongest animal on the farm to do this. But I think what's really important in this is that like it was telling a really important story and to children on how this is like um, how at some point in time good intentions for like the good intentions collectively can be corrupted by the self-interest of a handful of people. And I think that's like a great like if I took nothing else away from that story, it was that. And I think I learned that from a really young age.
And what about Philip K. Dick and David Shrandy?
So Philip K. Dick, if you ever watched Blade Runner, like the one from like the early, I think it's 81, or even kind of like the extension of that for or the inspiration for 20 Blade Runner 2049, like this becomes like a very important um, a very important story in my life on understanding like what is it to be human and uh, or what is it to be like or what is it to be a person and it's and how it transcends your like physical body. And so this is like a really important concept that's developed within this book called "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep," which eventually becomes like the Blade Runner movie. But Phil K. Dick's his his writing and his science fiction writing is has been fairly impactful, and in particular to that book on how I would like uh, view all science fiction. I kind of like benchmark it against that, but at the same time too, like how do I how do I think about and especially science fiction does this really good job of thinking about human behavior and what it is to be human and using technology or some like sort of variable for technology, whether it's like time travel or robots or aliens, and how do humans respond or how do people respond to something that's new like that? And oftentimes it really sticks to who people are at their core and what our beliefs are and our motivations are.
These authors have a very dystopian view of the future. Do you share that, or is that just something that you enjoy reading up on?
I like reading about the dystopian future in many ways. Although, like 1984 is like a very depressing book because the conclusion. I'm not going to ruin the conclusion to it, but it's very like the end is not a good one.
Nope,
But in
it's
some
not.
ways, it's probably the most depressing end to any story. And in some ways, I reflect on it. It's I think about it in the way that how it reflects humans, or human behavior, but in the way with, let's say, for example, with to enjoy stream of electric sheep, is that there there isn't really like a good or a bad outcome from it, beyond that like there's a possibility that or there's not necessarily a possibility, but like does it matter whether a person has like skin, flesh, and bones for them to have personhood? And I think these are kind of like the questions that like grapple with on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's like a really inspiring and and optimistic view of who we are as humans and how we see technology. And I think that's kind of it was relevant in that book and relevant especially now with the way how things have changed.
And let's close this with your father. What kind of impact has he had on your life?
My dad, uh, not great with technology, but it is typical for someone who is like, I guess for millennials who have their dads who sign off on their texts or texts saying it's your dad. Like, I love it. I love my dad a lot. Um, he's inspirational from the point that like I didn't understand him growing up to all of the things that I realized that he's done in the past 40 plus years of um, the, what it's like. And I think this had a big difference once I became a father, that my dad really did an excellent job of helping me understand like the sacrifices that are necessary for you to have like the sacrifices that are necessary for you to like have like a happy, let me say for the lack of a better term, like a happy home in some ways, but more so like just understanding how difficult it is to be a father, and appreciating the, the good and great parts of it, aside from sacrifice. And I think now when I saw my dad through the lens of being a child, as I see him through the lens of being an adult now, that like it's okay to change as a person, and who you were 30, 40 years ago is not the same person who you are now, and accepting that those differences or those changes are normal, and that it's okay to, you know, to forgive choices that were made back then because you didn't know better. And I think, and I know that sounds a little bit vague, but I think many of us can think about how relationships have changed over time, and that understanding that like, hey, your parents, in particular, my dad's also like a vulnerable person, that if you, the way how you see them as a kid is being like, hey, they're very like, they can be like very tough or authoritative, to being, hey, like times were really tough back then, and the way how things are now are significantly different. And I can appreciate, and I love that about who my father is right now. Like, and maybe that will change as he gets older, but as far as I know right now, like I have a lot of like admiration and respect for who he is, and his and the way how he's changed.
You got your first paper out when you were either eight or nine. And so what made you get a job that young, and who were you delivering papers for?
That's like a connection back to my dad. I mean, my parents have this like my parents had this like way of thinking about like, you need to be contributing, and I didn't know what I was contributing to back then. The reason to get a paper route, and then I shared it with my brother, and we were delivering like the Brampton Garden, which would have been like the newspaper for Brampton, but also like I think what was called the penny saver. So when you think about like classified ads that are in like a small like newsprint, and that you put flyers in them, and then you basically like get paid a couple of pennies for each house. And so what you like, the goal of all of this from my parents' perspective was to like learn and appreciate the discipline of hard work, and that it will contribute to something. And I didn't know what that something was. And really what it was doing was contributing to like my like future education. So the money that my brother and I had like, or like the money from the route that we had, basically had paid for our first year, like, well, me specifically, paid for my first year at university.
And speaking of university, what brought you to the University of Waterloo, and why did you study anthropology?
The University of Waterloo has a couple reasons. Like, one is that like my brother was already there. He's a couple years older. He was already in Waterloo at the University of Waterloo, and he had a car. And if I went to Waterloo, then we'd be able to split it.
Nice.
So we did that for a time. But also at the same time too, like Waterloo, I think I put a lot of value into that, like Maclean's ranking, and Waterloo had at that point was ranked number one for producing future leaders, one of the best schools in the country. And then thirdly, like on the anthropology part of it, is that like I thought that archaeology was amazing. I loved learning about the cultures of antiquity, and what I wanted to do was to have I don't know, to learn more about that. And Waterloo seemed like a great place.
We're going to take a quick break. Enjoying this episode? Of course you are, or you wouldn't have made it this far. Complement your listening experience by subscribing to the Media People newsletter at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or at mediapeople.beehive.com. It's a mix of original and curated content designed to feed your curiosity while aiding in personal development. On top of more podcasts, we'll connect you with articles, interviews, and industry events. Subscribe at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or mediapeople.beehive.com. After graduation, you didn't jump directly into media and ad tech. You had a series of jobs, and the first one was at Me to We. So what attracted you to that?
Free the Children Me to We offered an opportunity to work for a company that, or like work for an organization that at that time I thought was in agreement with my social values. One thing that I think like my university career was, or a big highlight of my university career was the volunteer work that I did and the social activism events that I participated in, the groups that I participated in as well too. Like those were really important and still have an imprint on who I am now, and very much a part of like some of the motivations and beliefs that I have. And the opportunity to work at Me to We, which is sort of like the not for profit part of Free the Children, which at that time, like I think we were making promotional items and mostly T-shirts for other organizations, so like schools and other charities and some corporations as well too. That the reason to go there was like the biggest reason to go there was because I thought that like I'd help to make a difference, and that the social values that I had would be or were in agreement or alignment with what Me to We and Free the Children stood for.
So you were looking more to make an impact than for a paycheck right out of university.
Yeah.
And no one's, and I know that oversimplifies it, but no one would blame a student after, and it's none of my business if you had to go into debt for it and take OSAP, but I know a lot of students after going through university are like, I just want to make money. That's it. They want to see a return on the investment they made on themselves.
So I like at the time I convocated in 2008. It was during the Great Recession, so like not many of my peers were working. There weren't jobs to be had, and I think that year, like I think from 2008 to basically like 2010 was like working service jobs, working in a call center, working in retail, working in a restaurant, and at the same time too volunteering as much as I could, because these were really these were really good experiences to have. I think back to how many years I volunteered at the Kitchener Public Library while I lived in Waterloo, and those are some of my favorite experiences. And then, like I said, these all have like an imprint on it. So I think like it's less so about like the hustle to make money and more so to like, are you really making an impact and contributing to something better?
How did you find your way into advertising operations at Sweet 66? Because this seems like a complete pivot from what you studied in university and even what you were doing, again, during the Great Recession for those 2 years.
So at this point, like if I think about the period of time after, even around Me to We, like I'm cashed out and I'm living downtown. I loved living in this like old, I love living in this old like Edwardian style house in Parkdale. And I lived in the attic of it. So it's very tiny, like maybe 400 square feet. I mean, some people say that they live in like a shoebox condo. Like I lived in like an old house. Very similar to like in some ways I joked about how it was like in Fight Club, but not nearly as like decrepit as like the Paper Street Mansion. But in at this point in time, like it's really tough to make a living. And so I worked in sales at like a previous to that, I worked in sales at a staffing firm, and I made enough money that I was able to pay off whatever debts that I had, and that thankfully I could just have a moment to figure out what am I going to do with my life moving forward. And so going to Sweet 66 was kind of like a boon in some ways, although it was like a very entry level position. And at that time too, like my brother was my brother, like can see this kind of trend of like I like following my brother to an extent. That my brother was already working there. He said it was a good environment, and that he said I'd be really good at it. And working in ad ops was great. Like it was very, very different than what I like, very different than what my expectations were, but also very different from what my expectations were of what I would want, what I wanted to do with my career, which was kind of to work more in like a in more of like a civil service kind of world of where I'm contributing to either making or affecting policy changes and to be quite honest, like kind of selfless to helping people. And so where I look at Sweet 66 is now the opportunity to kind of think to have some like experience working in like a for-profit business and understanding that, and at the same time too that I liked advertising. I learned about it when I studied anthropology. So part of like my discipline is in what's called applied anthropology, and so basically it's how you understand human behavior. You understand like that behavior in a culture, and more specifically to like what people do and how they interact with something on a larger basis, and how can you basically commercialize these really like interesting behaviors or understand like how a product works or how a product is adopted based on how people think about it. And working in ad ops gave me like a good understanding of like how do ad campaigns get created, how do ad campaigns get set up in a way that you can think about the mechanical pieces and also the mechanical processes of how do ads go about influencing someone to do something.
Was it a bit of a cold shower, though? Because I imagine in your anthropology course or in your program, what they taught about advertising was completely different from what you do in ad operations.
To an extent, I think I would say to an extent. So like ad operations is very much about like the mechanical parts of pressing buttons and making sure that fields are filled in correctly. Where I found that I was very successful in ad ops had a lot to do with my ability to put myself in the shoes of who I was trying to influence with an ad. So if it meant that like something very simple like, hey, uh, here's like a here's an ad from a dealership with a rate for Toyotas in Atlantic, Canada. Well, who are the people that are most, I would think about this, who are the people that are most receptive to that message? What are the combinations of sites and placements and pricing that I want to pay for that influence to happen? And am I most receptive to this at a certain time of the day, or am I most receptive to it in a certain type of website or environment, or even like how does the ad show up on a page? These are still early days of programmatic media buying, but I would ask myself this question about like, does a person see this ad? If they see this ad, what are they likely to do? And back then you would have like made the argument, and I guess to some extent you still make that argument now that someone clicks on an ad, but the um, the very important part to this is how do you just make that literally how do you make that impression on a person, is what I thought about, and I think that was the kind of like the hidden connection in let's say applied anthropology in what's like postmodern, like in a very modern way, thinking about ethnography and the study of culture and how that impression, that imprint is is incredibly important on uh, influencing a change for a person and then many people.
When you resigned and moved to Olive Media, did you have to submit your resignation and give your 2 weeks notice to your brother? Serious question.
No, no. That would have been very funny. in retrospect, I wonder what that would have been like. Resigning would have been like, well, no, I'm just taking my ball and going home now. Like, uh, no, although that's happened a lot. But at this point, no, I resigned to my manager, I think, and then she reported to him, but I don't think he was at the company at that time. I think he was like on a leave or something. But it was impactful. I had made a lot of friends while I was at Sweet 66, and I'd made some pretty good, like some of those people I'm still friends. I'm very much friends with today. Many of them were either at my wedding and some of them in my wedding party.
Chris Quinn was
I,
recently on.
oh yeah, so I know Chris, not from Sweet 66, not my Sweet 66 days, but from my time at OMG that I'd met Chris. But definitely there's a lot of people from that Sweet 66 family that are kind of floating around all over. It's kind of neat because there's also people who are like the Sweet 66 people who some of them or a couple of them had gone to Olive, um, and many of them are kind of spread out all over. It was a great environment. It was kind of like the one like where Mark Thomas, CEO, would say that like this is the place where people go to begin their career, and many people have gone on to be successful from Sweet 66.
So your role at Olive Media, what attracted you to leaving Sweet and joining Olive?
It was the opportunity to learn. Like I had found that like I learned things very quickly at Sweet, and they were limited by kind of limited by some of their capabilities, but also that uh, Olive presented like the opportunity to work on things on a very big scale. And for me, like I think you can, I think I would say that in some ways I'm very ambitious about some of the things that I want to accomplish. And Olive was the opportunity to work on like a varying amount of different brands, different capabilities as well too. And they were um, in some ways like much more sophisticated than Sweet 66 because of the size of their teams, the size of their investments, the relationships that they had, um, and the complexity of how those campaigns were being planned were like you could see that immediately from the time I started working there.
What brought you back to Sweet 66? Because you did a bit of a U-turn after.
Like I said, I had a lot of friends through there. Um, a lot of really great, fantastic, and lifelong relationships. You can say.
Was it the
It,
culture and
it
the
was
people, or was there, and I mean this in a very sincere way, because you said you left Olive just for the opportunity to learn. Was there something new at Sweet 66 that Olive couldn't offer you?
I think there's two things about it. One was that like by the time I had resigned at Olive, the writing was on the wall about what was going to happen.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah.
like within a year of me resigning, the company had folded. So it was very sad because like I also had like a lot of very good friends and great relationships from Olive as well too. But um, the opportunity to become a product manager. So you think about like where my progression started in like the mechanical parts of ad ops that I think is like really critical to a lot of this. That the opportunity now to design campaigns and design capabilities is something that I really wanted to get my hands on. Just because like when you're in platform, you don't really get the opportunity to create. You're doing a lot of like the execution parts of it, where I wanted to be in a more strategic role, and being a product manager for Suite was really like the opportunity to think about how to really progress the programmatic trading practice that was at Suite 66.
As you progressed into, say, a senior product manager role, do you start to manage people more?
It was actually like I managed one person for a brief period of time, but really this is like when I think about progression, not necessarily from the standpoint of I think about not from the standpoint of managing people, but more so of like being learning about being a good leader and trying to apply apply that practice of being a good leader. And what that meant was, at least from my like experience, was about how to be very like disciplined about the knowledge that I had in a way that would benefit the company. And I know that to make it very real is that like this is where like there are many different tools that you can use to do this, but I found that like there's a soft reliance that I have on project management that was very helpful to be a good leader and understanding who my stakeholders are and understanding how to manage budgets and knowing what the priorities are of the company so that what we're trying to execute satisfies all those different conditions. Um, I found that um, managing people became kind of the symptom of the necessity to achieve the business goals.
You said something interesting there. You talked about managing the different objectives that might come up from different parts of the company. Did you find yourself acting more and more like a politician?
In some ways, you have to be a politician because you do represent, let's say you represent constituents from, you do represent constituents depending on the department that they're in. Politician can also be like observed with in like a more pejorative sense of like, hey, like you're always going to make a bad decision if you make, you're always going to have like, there's always going to be a perspective that you've made a bad decision um, because you've had to make one. So in which case it's the understanding that like not everyone will be if it's going to be the politician label, it's going to be the standpoint of we're making difficult decisions and some people will like them and some people they'll have to be okay with some people not liking those decisions either.
The opportunity to join Accuen, and I believe now the Accuen name no longer exists. So you're joining OMG, their programmatic team. What attracted you to leaving, say, network and publisher side and going to the agency side of the business?
At the time, I couldn't have been like more thrilled to have basically gone from being like at Sweet 66. I thought about how like we had we had a really great like programmatic trading practice and team there, like a lot of really great knowledge, but we were limited by the size of the company and the size of the budgets and the types of relationships, whether it was on the publishing side or on the advertising side. Um, where Accuen, which eventually became like OMG programmatic, um, it was the opportunity to work and be a leader in the biggest trading desk in the country. Um, and the opportunity to work with Tom Botheringham, who, if you have like a reputation that precedes yourself, like I was like, wow, I get to work with someone who is an industry leader and a pioneer for programmatic buying in Canada. Um, I couldn't have been like more thrilled to do that. And I thought I was like, and like this is where I think that one of the best decisions I'd ever made in my career was making that choice to go to the agency.
And how did your role change when you were promoted to, say, director of platform and capabilities?
When that happened, I inherited a very large team of people. Where before I would have been much more focused on like being a subject matter expert and a leader within the programmatic practice to develop new capabilities. Now it was like when I became director, more I would say more so that like it was about managing people to help develop new capabilities, manage investment, also like engineering as well too. Like these are all kind of folded into kind of the day-to-day responsibilities that I had. But it became, like I said, that leader piece um, became kind of parallel with the people management part of it, which that was like very new for me in that sense. I even at that time too, a couple of my close friends had recognized like, hey, like when was the last time you managed a person? I was like, I haven't really. And someone bought me a book that was really helpful. And I still stick with the principles of that today. This book called The Best Team Wins. And it really goes through about like, and you I've mentioned this a few times about how does understanding how people make an impact and adapting your leadership and management style to drawing the most out of how a person feels that they're making an impact um, on their team. And I think that was the biggest change was really in understanding how how to get the most out of people, how to motivate people, and have them really connect with the work that they're doing.
And that only got bigger for you because you were promoted to group director of digital platforms. So how did that change versus director of platform and capabilities?
That part made a big difference when I was like I was part of a. I think one of the things that maybe not doesn't get talked about too much is that like the pitching at the agency is the lifeblood of it. So if you win new clients, win new accounts, that's really what keeps the agency going. And I'd been on some pretty high profile pitches that were successful. And that's where I had I had the opportunity now to expand beyond what I was doing strictly in programmatic, and looking at more so like holistically across like a digital biddable practice across the entire like the entirety of like OMG Canada on basically developing the best practices and bringing together the smartest people in each like biddable discipline and like search, social, and display and video together to establish best practices and how to manage not just how to manage their teams, but like how to create really good campaigns.
How do you communicate all of that to a prospect? Because how can I put this? Like I'm in sales and we respond to RFPs. There's a list of objectives and we show how we're going to satisfy those objectives. And stop me if I've got this completely wrong. I've never been agency side, so I don't want to be presumptuous in any way. You're representing agency X. You're going up against agency Y. You're bidding on their, say, for example, their programmatic business, maybe search and social as well too. But you're both offering in a way the same thing because we know a lot of the agencies lead with usually the trade desk or DB360, and they've probably got a combination of both that they're using. When you say social, everyone's using or prioritizing the same top social platforms. When it comes to search, we know that a big chunk of it is Google, and then a smaller portion of it goes into Bing. So knowing that you guys are going to be bidding against someone that's going to be offering up the same platforms, because let's face it, you can't go anywhere else. How do you differentiate yourself? Like, what do you say you're doing differently?
There's like the agency talk track for something like this, which usually has to do with like the right combination of people. Like, do you have like the right combination of people? Like do you have like the right roles in place, the kind of service, the expertise, there's the platforms, which are like the technology that you're using, what's proprietary to an agency or to a holding company, and how that affects the processes. So the processes being like, hey, how do you plan? How do you measure success? How do you like bill me on time? How do you like how do I get like that right mix of like outcomes with the fees that I'm paying? That's kind of like the agency kind of like more or less the agencies all compete on those three different spaces. And you're thinking about it strictly from if you really break it down, that the way how an agency wins, and my perspective, that it has a lot to do with the service that you provide. And what you'll kind of see is that like the larger like the larger multinational brands, they're working with the larger holdcos, and the smaller local, I don't say smaller, but the more local brands, like in Canada, they're working with like the boutique agencies because it's necessary that if you're smaller, you need things to be a little bit, or if you're like, let's say you don't have like really big budgets, that you need something that's a little bit more customizable and a little bit more like uh high, like let's say you need a little bit more of like a white glove service. And I found that too, that at any point in time in my career, is that like working in a small, like working at Suite 66, and I'll give you a great example of this, is that when I worked with a data management platform, we picked one that was really good because they were able to customize things and fit the product to the needs of what our business was. But being at the big holdco, we were at the mercy of what the Americans do. And when you're negotiating these technology contracts on a global basis, you get very little say in like feature requests and developments. I don't know how many times I'd like screamed at a DSP to do this thing that was really basic, and like that just never happened. If I had my hand up, I'd still be there with my hand up. So that's where I think that like the ability to be really nimble, and that's why you also saw this like trend of, hey, a brand wants to work with an agency, well, we'll just create an entirely new agency solely focused on that brand. And you kind of saw that happen a lot, while there's sort of like the dabbling of insourcing or in-housing media, like media activation and media planning services.
Oh, there's a number of examples like that. I know Rogers, that's happened a couple of times as well when they've moved between holding co's where it's been like, I think under Mindshare it was like Theo, like named after like Ted Rogers, the founder. I think Heart and Science was dedicated to P&G at one point. I think they might have other clients now as well. But yeah, you're right. They do create that sort of like micro business within a business specifically catered to that brand.
Very
So
common.
yeah, it is very common. So you secured a series of promotions at, say, Sweet 66 and OMG. Anyone listening to this wants to grow within the company they're at. What advice would you give them?
A really great piece of advice was in determining how you can become invaluable, and I think uh, that was something that I learned. I learned over time, or at least within like my first year or two at OMG, was that becoming invaluable meant that the company couldn't do without some of the things that you do. And I think about that impact. I think about that the impact on like almost every day, not just about OMG, but in general about how many times I had like foregone a promotion or a salary increase because what I was chasing was the most difficult projects to be on, over over just over accepting something that I thought would be just like, all right, well, I'll take this like raise this year, or I'm going to take this like change in my title because I get to like have like a more like a greater profile within an agency or the within the whole co. I think what kind of gets lost on all of this is that like um, I've been very focused on the things that I want to learn, and and it has coincided with some of the things that are the most challenging. And I've kind of dedicated my career in media towards doing those things, and that's where I found to have the most success. And if nothing else, like in that piece to become invaluable, there are important people who will see that passion that you have. I think if you like really give a shit about your job, um, not in the way that like is very, I would like caution about like being very demanding about the things that you need, but more so about um, really caring about the success of really caring about the success of the company, in particular that you're like bought in on the values of the company, and that the people who you work with, who you influence and who you are influenced by have a stake in the development of your career and your contribution to the values that that company has. And so that's why I found that like it's at OMG, I was very successful because there were some pretty interesting challenges that existed in mobile media, extremely difficult challenges that existed in how let's say contemporary media investment is done on a whole scale level. And there are some pretty big global challenges that I participated in as well too that I thought were um, I like to think that they're like worthy in that like, hey, like, if we figure this out, we can change some pretty big things in how media is purchased, and the ethical parts of how media is purchased as well too. That if these sorts of things are figured out on a global scale, then what impact can that end up having downstream? And so I think having that passion and having that like understanding how your impact is invaluable and how you're making a difference to not just the bottom line but to the values of the company are really critical or like I'd say like very critical for very critical if you aspire to have a greater leadership role.
Okay, so let's bring things full circle, and I want to tie it back into what you just said there about your move to the Globe and Mail. Even though it is one of Canada's biggest and premier media companies, you said something really interesting, and I could tell in your voice that you were very giddy about being part of this, where you had the opportunity to work on global campaigns and shape the way programmatic media was bought. So basically, like setting policy or customs for everyone around the globe. Moving to the Globe and Mail, I'm sure it had its wonderful challenges, but it doesn't sound like those traits or those tasks would have carried over to just a national media company, publisher side.
I like to think that they do.
Please, no,
There's
go for it. Tell us.
one of the things that I thought was one of the things that I thought was really, really important was in a transparent supply chain, and in knowing, and I still do, and in knowing that like how many intermediaries are necessary to bring an ad impression from a website to a person who's consuming the content that it sits beside or a part of. What was necessary in that entire, and like think about all of those different like intermediaries necessary and necessary or otherwise that are part of this part of this process, and unpacking all of that made a big difference in terms of why the Globe became very attractive. Um, One was that because like the Globe and Mail is like a really important brand, but the same or really important brand for Canadians. But at the same point in time too is that like there was a lot of theoretical research that we were doing at OMG, and I wanted to put that into practice. And when we're talking about the
Ah,
specific
I see now where you're going with this. Okay, yes.
with the specific part, and to be very specific about the relationship, like the relationship between a person who's consuming information and the person that's providing it, and the consent that's necessary for that information to be transferred from one to the other.
So it's like a
Um,
scientist then who's got all of these theories, but they don't have the funding or let alone the resources to apply it anywhere, to like take it from, I guess what they call it is the science phase to the engineering phase.
yeah, this is really about putting it into practice. And the Globe, like I said, the Globe's um, value to Canadians. Uh, Argue it what you will, but the Globe does provide an incredible amount of value to that, let's say, the average Canadian. Um, if nothing else, being a national news outlet provides information that's really necessary for people to live their day-to-day lives in Canada. That this became like a really good chance to now like, hey, if I understand how, if I stop thinking about users in that sense and start thinking about them being as like content consumers and specifically readers, that when you humanize them that way, it becomes very easy to help understand that this is a culture of people who like reading the Globe. How how does a commercial application work with a culture? And how do you do it in a way that respects the privacy of the people who want to read and pay for reading?
So you're moved to the Globe and Mail. Do you apply for the job? Do you get headhunted? Or do you maybe perhaps have a relationship with them already from your OMG days? Because I imagine you were buying their inventory, whether it be not just on the open exchange, but you probably had private marketplace deals. Maybe that you even had a chance to receive their data pitch before you moved over there.
The last part of the data pitch was not terribly good. I'll be honest with that. Like it was, but it was not good from that sense. Good from the sense that it was a blank slate, and I was headhunted. I wasn't really looking, to be quite honest. But when the opportunity had posed itself, I was I was very curious about it. And then when I realized the way how things were currently at the Globe and the opportunity for change, um, I was very excited with the opportunity of what we could do. Like it would make a really big difference in terms of how I felt about my relationship with the kind of work that I do. Um, and I felt really great about having the opportunity to work with actual readers, not like hypothetical. cookies or third-party data. It was real people.
Okay, so you've had the opportunity to work network side, you've worked agency side, and this was your first crack at working in publishing. So doing what you've done across the board there, how has it differed in, say, the previous two areas to what you're doing right now at the Globe and Mail?
The biggest difference here is in being, in like the technical terms, a data owner or a data contributor. That makes a gigantic difference. Um, and I think where a big strength that being in a publisher, especially the Globe, is that there's a big strength in having just like the access to data, or and by what I mean that is like understanding the readers that are on it as opposed to like proxies for it. And overall, where I think that there may be, let's say, a vulnerability in the agency model because of this, and that they're limited to being, at best, a data steward or an intermediary that's necessary for moving user data from one place to another. Um, where I think now, like, this has come full circle to my like formal education in anthropology and ethnography. Like, we take almost like an ethnographic approach, like our team, the team that I'm a part of, we take almost an ethnographic approach to how we understand the cultures of the people who read and the motivations and behaviors that go behind the general Globe readership. Um, where this is something that an agency is almost never privy to. It's not something that they would do that type of analysis because one, it's like either high risk, or two, it doesn't fit into the commercial model of what they're trying to accomplish. So I think if in many ways, like for me particular, I'm very keen to using a method of how different partnerships and how organizations can cooperate or collaborate with each other. And some of the work that the Globe and Mail has done with, let's say, data clean rooms wouldn't necessarily be possible through an agency model because there isn't really a commercial aspect to it. And also that there's the privacy risk to having an intermediary involved. So I think those are kind of constraints that would be really difficult to the agency relative to where where data owners or data contributors like publishers and brands, they really have like a great advantage of how they can work together because there are fewer kind of points of friction in between.
Bill, this has been a fantastic chat. Are you ready for rapid fire questions?
Yeah, let's do that.
The campaign you're most proud of?
Oh, there's been thousands of campaigns. The most recent one, I think there's, I kind of alluded to this um, with how we use a data clean room, but via rail and like the via rail campaigns that I've worked on the last year, especially the way how we've matured and progressed some of the capabilities for data clean room and measuring ticket sales from ad exposures is like I think this is kind of the thing that I'm very keen on, and what I've probably in the recency bias of my experience tells me that like this is probably one of my more favorite things, or favorite campaigns you could say.
Your favorite movie?
Too tough. Yeah, I love Fight Club. I think if anything, like Fight Club as it existed over like maybe 20 years ago, um, as relevant as it was then as it is today, especially for especially in understanding today's like contemporary political landscape relative to like a masculine viewpoint, um, or point of view, like so relevant.
If Hollywood were to make a movie based on your life story, who would you want to play you?
I would say Jeffrey Wright. Um, he's the like American, like the American agent in the newer James Bond movies. Um, but he also plays a character. He plays one of the main characters in Westworld. That actor would look similar, but more so than like my wife and I even agree that like his mannerisms and how he acts are very similar to the way how I am.
My follow-up, if Hollywood were to make that movie based on your life story, what would you call it?
It'd either be called Humor Me or Can I Have a Moment, or even combine the two, Humor Me for a Moment.
Your favorite book?
These are really hard. More recently, I read a book. called "I've Been Meaning to Tell You" by David Chariandi. He's a local author. Um, Similar upbringing to mine. He's Trinidadian descent, but it's basically like a letter to his daughter about his experience growing up in basically the GTA. He's also now like an accomplished academic and writer, but this book I read cover to cover twice in the day that I got it. Fantastic book.
Your favorite song?
There's two really like it's hard to pick. So one that like I'll like for my wife it'll be Karma Police by Radiohead. This is the song we bonded on, in the way how I think we were sitting around in a lunchroom with some coworkers many years ago, and Radiohead was coming to Toronto, and I think it was in the Star and Don't Hate Me Globe. I read the Star. They said they're coming to town. Can anyone recognize? Can anyone memorize, or does anyone recall the lyrics to Karma Police? And then you'd be like a real Radiohead fan. And so at that point, I had recited the lyrics. And back then, my coworker, who is now my wife, we were the only two that knew all the lyrics for Karma Police. But to add that in, like De La, I Know by De La Soul has a huge influence on who I am as a person growing up, who I am today. Like, not quite the same story, but it has had longevity throughout the 30 plus years in my life.
Best advice you've ever received?
I'd have to like credit Malcolm X. This is like a thing in my family about, and his quote is, "Education is a passport to your future." This is in the essence of almost every Caribbean household that I've visited or been a part of growing up and today. Like I think this is like a really important part to someone's like current understanding of themselves and future understanding of themselves. And I don't mean like education as a means of like commercial success. Education as a means of being a better contributor and being more active in your community.
If you could go back in time and give your younger self advice, what would you say?
Oh, I remember one time, I think it was like 2011, I was sitting around with a friend and we were considering putting like $500 into buying Bitcoin at 30 cents back then.
Oh, jeez.
I would have been wildly wealthy at this point in my life. I wish I would go back and had done things differently then. But I think, if anything, the advice I give myself is that like life is too short to be hung up on our differences, and it's really important to me.
My signature closing question: if you weren't in media, what would you be doing and why?
Oh, definitely. I've thought about this a lot. If I didn't have to work in media, I didn't have to work anymore. I'd probably have a cattle farm that also raised pasture chickens. It's like barbecuing is kind of like a passion and craft that I have. And I think through the appreciation of this craft, I've learned how to work with like really good ingredients and doing so. Like I like kind of like dabbled with like butcher apprenticeship, and doing so, then you learn about like the importance of how animals are raised and the quality of life that they have. And so I don't know if I'm always going to eat meat in my life, but I know that for some people that'll be a staple for them. But I think that being very conscious about your consumption and the ethical treatment of animals is really important, and having a transparent supply chain of how we bring meat from a farm to table is really important, and how we have an appreciation for the food that we eat.
And we're going to end things right here. Kabil, thanks for stopping by.
My pleasure. Thank you.